Let's get going with our words of wisdom. These words are from Peter F. Drucker, who said, "It's more important to do the right thing than to do things right." Who agrees with that? Sounds like most of us agree with that. I would guess that most of us would consider that to be true. After all, growing up, we are told quite often, do the right thing, make responsible choices. And this is a pretty simple concept. It's pretty straightforward. Or is it? Because that message, that statement, do the right thing, actually makes a very large assumption. And the assumption is that you know what the right thing to do is, right? It makes a very grand assumption. So if you were told that as a kid growing up, has anyone ever told that growing up by their teacher or their parents or something, do the right thing? There's a very grand assumption there going on behind the scenes. So what is the right thing? Do you always know what the right thing is? Who here always knows what the right thing is? I knew we'd have at least one. I knew we'd have at least one. First service we got by with no one, but this, if anyone else needs to know what the right thing is, Lene's happy to help you. Okay, thank you, Lene. And she probably does, actually. All right. So early on in childhood and growing up, the right thing is actually quite a bit more simple because we're given very clear instructions. Do this, don't do that. This is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong. So discerning the right thing is not too difficult at that stage of the game. But as you grow and mature into an adult and you go out into the world, you recognize that things are not always so black and white. There's a lot of gray area in life, and the right and the wrong don't show up so obviously to you. So now you have to discern what is the right thing in this new scenario. And especially as you grow spiritually, your concept of right and wrong, your concept of the right thing is going to morph and expand and unfold before you, where before the right thing might be mostly focused on the finite and what's happening in the microcosm. But as you begin to unfold spiritually, it goes to the macrocosm. You start looking beyond yourself, beyond just what's around you, and getting more expanded view. So really we are faced with a dilemma. We know we should do the right thing, but we're not sure what the right thing is. So let's see if we can sort of establish some sort of baseline right now that we can all agree on what the right thing is. And without building a complicated backstory behind it, like we all love to do in Unity, is it good or should you steal somebody else's car? Some of you still thinking about you're building that backstory. You're like, well, you know, if someone's pregnant, they're about to give birth, and no backstories. So we pretty much can agree. It's pretty straightforward. If you want to do the right thing, you don't steal somebody's car. And we could consider that sort of a basic morality. We can consider that a basic healthy morality that is established among people. But morality is a fascinating thing to play around with. Because in many ways, we assume morality is the same for all of us, or should be the same for all of us. And anyone who acts out of alignment with what we think morality is, we consider them to be wrong or unnatural or immoral because of their actions. But if some things are moral and some things are immoral, who gets to decide? Who gets the final say there? Who gets to set the standard for the moral code that we must all live by? Now we're starting to get into some sticky territory. Because for hundreds of years, the old religion had the concept that they got to set the moral code, and they got to enforce this moral code. But it has become quite clear over time that their sense of morality is often biased and warped and dangerous and not even in alignment with their own beliefs and their own truth. Well, all of this leads to something I heard months ago that I have wanted to talk about every time I've heard it, but it hadn't quite placed itself in the right spot. So we're actually going to finally cover it today. And what I heard, what inspired me, was an episode of the podcast Radio Lab. Is anyone here familiar with the podcast Radio Lab? Okay, good. So I was afraid when I wrote this talk that no one would have any concept of what I'm talking about, but 8 of you do. So the rest of you, we're going to have a small time for you to get together and figure out what it is from the other people who know what it is. It's a podcast. That's all you need to know. We're going to move on. I'll explain it. Radiolab is one of my favorite podcasts to listen to. And when I ministered in Las Vegas at Unity of Las Vegas, I talked about Radiolab a lot in my Sunday sermons. So much so that I thought about changing the church's name from Unity of Las Vegas to Unity of Radiolab. Thought maybe that might draw some more people through the front door. And what I think is great about this graphic I created for you this morning is that I managed to violate 3 trademarks in one image. So I'm pretty proud of myself there. But let's get on with our topic for today. The specific Radiolab episode I'm referring to is entitled The Trolley Problem Update from September 27th, 2017. And for us to really get into this concept and understand it, I will unfortunately have to introduce you to a somewhat morose thought experiment. So please bear with me. I did not come up with this. This is a very old and actually widespread thought experiment, quite well known to most people. And this experiment is important because it pushes us to really look at the core of our morality and to look at what triggers our morality to spring into action, to do something. So here is how it goes. You are an observer. You are watching a trolley that is barreling down the tracks. That trolley cannot see what is ahead, but you can. You see that there are construction workers working on the track up ahead. They are unaware of the trolley, and the trolley is unaware of them. You, as the observer, also notice 5 of them are working on the track that goes straight ahead, but only 1 of them is working on the track that diverts off to the side. Now, lo and behold, you realize you are standing by the track switch that could divert the trolley away from the track with the 5 people on it onto the track towards a person with 1 on it. And now you realize you could do something about what is about to unfold. You could pull that lever, divert that trolley onto the other track, and save 5 lives at the expense of 1 life. So here is the thought experiment. Do you pull that lever? Now remember, before you decide in your head, if you choose to pull that lever, you will save 5 lives. But by doing so, you will consciously and willfully be choosing to take the life of that one. On the other hand, if you choose not to pull the lever, fate will go on uninhibited, and the 5 people will lose their lives just like they would have if you had never come on this scene. Time is running out. What do you do? So raise your hand if you would pull the lever to save the 5 at the expense of the 1. First service had a little more guts, but that's okay. This thought experiment has actually been a part of countless actual studies, psychological studies, including one that they spoke about in the Radiolab episode I was watching or listening to. And by and large, your average person, after they think about it, chooses to pull that lever. They choose to do that. So we might say this established sort of a baseline for humanity or morality for humans. Given these circumstances, we often will choose to save 5 lives over 1. And Spock would definitely agree with that choice because he said the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the 1. Very wise, logical man. Does everyone know who Spock is, or are you totally lost right now? I hope at least 3/4 of you know what Spock is. If that's your first question in the group in the back, don't bother. That's not really where we're going with the conversation. Okay. You thought you were off the hook, but the experiment actually gets more complicated now, and we're going to really play with your moral compass. And again, I apologize for the subject matter. It is pretty dark, but this is how the experiment goes. Similar scenario, but now you are standing on a bridge. You still see a trolley coming, unaware of the 5 workers ahead on the track. And this time, there is no track to divert that trolley onto, but you do still have a choice. Would you physically push a person off that bridge onto the tracks in order to stop the trolley and save the 5 people? 1 for 5. Again, horrifying, I know. I did not come up with this, but just bear with me on this as we move forward. Here is why this gets really interesting. Fundamentally, this is the exact same choice. Take 1 life in order to save 5. But study after study shows that 9 out of 10 people would not physically push that person to save 5 people. Now, I find that fascinating, and researchers also found this fascinating, because logically, it is the same exact outcome. You have chosen 1 life versus 5 lives. But morality draws a line in the sand just in the subtle difference between touching a lever and touching a person. It draws a line in the sand right there in terms of that outcome. Now, Jad Abumrad and Robert Coleridge, if you know, are the hosts of the show, and they are interviewing in this episode a Princeton researcher by the name of Josh Green, who has studied this phenomena at length. And he asks a very basic, fundamental question in this clip.
How do people make this judgment? Forget whether or not these judgments are right or wrong, just what's going on in the brain that makes people distinguish so naturally and intuitively between these 2 cases, which from an actuarial point of view are very, very, very similar, if not identical.
So he did a study connecting people to a brain scanner. And he presented them with this scenario of being on the bridge, and he would run the scan at the moment they were making the decision of what they would do to see which part of the brain would light up. This is clearly a morality issue requiring higher advanced thinking, and so we would assume, if we know the brain, a certain area is going to light up. But at the moment of the decision, what he found was it was not the frontal lobe that lit up, not the higher, more advanced part of the brain that lit up, but it was actually the lower part of the brain, the primal reptilian part of the brain, the oldest part of the brain that was lighting up to make this choice. Now, why would this more simplistic part of the brain be chiming in on such a complicated issue? Well, this is what he has to say.
Our primate ancestors, before we were full-blown humans, had intensely social lives. They have social mechanisms that prevent them from doing all the nasty things that they might otherwise be interested in doing. And so deep in our brain, we have what you might call basic primate morality.
Which is interesting because in spirituality and religion, we often make the assumption that our animal or primal instincts are connected to the ego, and therefore they are bad and should be eradicated. But our animal ancestors have actually always had a very strict and clear moral code that they lived by, thousands of years before we ever showed up on the scene. And many religions would take issue with me saying that, but in Unity we see God manifesting in and through all creatures, in and through evolution, and that all of it is just a part of the beautiful dance of the divine. None of it is excluded in that process. So back to Josh Green, who calls this primal moral compass our inner chimp.
Now that case, I think it's a pretty easy case. Even though it's 5 versus 1, in that case, people just go with what we might call the inner chimp. But there are other...
The inner chimp is your unfortunate way of describing an act of deep goodness.
Right, well, that's what's interesting.
It's up 10 commandments for God.
Right,
inner chimp.
Right, well, what's interesting is that we think of basic human morality as being handed down from on high. And it's probably better to say that it was handed up from below.
You see, the early church was able to gain so much power and control because they convinced everyone that morality came from on high, and that they were the only ones that had access to on high, which put them as a go-between. But in reality, and like we say in Unity, it is all already right here within you. There is nothing in between you and the divine. It is all already right within you. Morality all along was built into your genetic makeup the moment you were born. It was not handed down from on high, and they even debate, was it handed down from parents? And they say, no, it doesn't appear that it was handed down from your parents or your social surroundings. You were born with morality. So instead of vilifying our animal ancestors and brothers and sisters, we could have been learning from them for the last few thousand years, but we vilified them as lower and degrading and not knowing much. So in its basic form, morality is instinctual, as they're discovering. We may think we are making a choice from this really intellectually advanced place because we're humans and we're special, but really it comes down to a basic instinct, not the movie. I could have set a stopwatch just to see how long that took to roll out. Okay. So really what is happening is it's not this reasoning intellect that is making these choices. Really it is our deep-seated primal instincts that are making these choices. They are what is steering the bus in these moments. And here's where this episode got very fascinating to me. For thousands of years, we have faced some very basic situations as animals. For example, a chimpanzee learns early on that you don't push another chimpanzee out of a tree. It's bad for the individual. It's bad for the group as a whole, the family structure that they live in. You just don't do that. That's going to be a very early basic lesson that they're going to learn. That then is now imprinted in our primal code. You don't push another chimpanzee out of the tree. So when faced with the bridge scenario, that primal instinct, that inner chimp screams out, no, don't push. Even if logically, as Spock pointed out, it is better to save 5 over the 1. The inner chimp overrules the logical mind and says, don't push, we don't harm another. But in the scenario with the switch, that is something more complicated than our primal ancestors ever faced before. There were no trolleys, there were no tracks or mechanical systems that could put so much space between cause and effect. This is crucial, so I need you to listen and understand this point. For thousands of years, if you were to cause another chimp to fall out of a tree, you had to physically push that chimp. There was no button, there was no lever that could put separation between you and the act of making that chimp fall. Does that make sense? It was a very hands-on experience. So, the trolley scenario where you can pull a switch is completely uncharted territory for the inner chimp. It cannot relate to this. So it doesn't recognize it as a morality issue, and therefore allows a different voice to come to the surface and make that choice. So we see that the inner chimp operates from a very basic understanding of morality due to its lack of experience with these complicated systems we now have today. These complicated scenarios that it never faced before. It has the best intentions. The inner chimp has the best intentions, but morality has gotten way more complicated since humanity came on the scene. And some might say morality has plummeted in the last few decades. So, we might ask, what has happened to our internal moral compass?
And basic primate morality doesn't understand things like tax evasion.
Basic primate morality doesn't understand things like tax evasion. Tax evasion does not trigger that internal moral compass because our inner chimp never had to deal with taxes. It doesn't understand modifying your taxes to get more gain for yourself at the expense of others. It doesn't understand the ramifications of not filing your taxes. It doesn't even understand why you would file your taxes. That did not exist for thousands of years. Now listen to this because it just might help you finally understand the world around you. The inner chimp also never dealt with deforestation, water pollution, poverty and income gaps, oil spills, government and corporate corruption, insider trading, drugs, housing shortages, collateral damage, nuclear weapons, guns, human rights, free speech, the internet, and countless other moral issues that plague modern humanity. It never had to face any of those. People in seats of power today are dealing with situations that require an incredibly heightened sense of morality. But in many cases, they have nothing to draw from because their inner chimp is confused and therefore silent. So they can go ahead and allow their company to dump toxic chemicals into a public water supply, or they can release a product that actually does more harm to people than good, because our complex systems have allowed us to be separated from the results of our actions. We have put too much distance between cause and effect. Too much for us to be able to feel that connection, which would trigger our inner chimp to say, no, we don't do that. For example, people think, who am I really hurting if I'm illegally downloading music off the internet? There is way too much distance from the person sitting at their computer and the musician who wrote that song for their morality to be triggered and say, I'm hurting a person. But we would never walk up to a street musician and pull $1 out of their guitar case. Do you see what I'm getting at? Because as we have seen time and time again, take a person who's willing to do harm from a great distance and place them next to the person or people they are doing harm to, and they cannot do it. A few weeks ago, Reverend Jack shared a documentary with you called Sacrifice, and some of you might have had the pleasure of actually watching that movie. In that documentary, we follow Phil. This is Phil, a white American man who is a racist and takes issue with Mexicans. This is a documentary. This is a real man. This really happened. He is racist for all the same nonsense reasons that too many people get tricked into believing. And I want you to hear that very clearly. They get tricked into believing. So they take this Phil, this gentleman here, and they put him alone in a room with another Mexican man, roughly his age. And they place them in 2 chairs facing each other, maybe just a few feet apart. And they tell them that they have to stare into each other's eyes for an indefinite period of time. And after just a few minutes, you get to watch one of the most incredible things happen that has ever been caught on film. You watch this man close the gap, remove the distance between himself and his own ignorance. His ignorance was at large. It was so far away that he never had to be faced with it. But they closed the gap and they put it just inches away for him to see. And the facade of who he was tricked into believing he was completely melts away right before your eyes, to the point where he is compelled by the power of love, the same power that moves through every single thing, every single individual on this planet. He is compelled by his heart to stand up and walk over and give that man a hug. A perfect stranger who was once his enemy, who was different from him, who was unlike him, who was another race, who was an inferior, and he could not help but walk over and give that man a hug in tears. But in that moment, he closed the gap and couldn't deny the reality of their oneness. He had to live in denial in order to have a consciousness of racism. But when they tore down that gap, he could not deny the reality of their oneness. You see, in that moment, his morality was finally awakened because the situation was simplified. It stopped being about borders and jobs and walls and homeland security. It stopped being about one country versus another or any other nonsense that the inner chimp could not comprehend. In that moment, it was simplified down to the true issue at hand. It was just two people sitting in a room. And in that scenario, the inner chimp could quite clearly see, this is my friend, this is my brother, we help each other, we protect each other, we need each other to survive. That is the voice that finally got to speak when all that nonsense was taken away. But for that to happen, the complications and distractions had to be peeled away to reveal the simplicity of the real issue at hand, which is really the only issue at hand. We are in this together, and this experience is much more enjoyable when we work together as one. Now, could that transformation that Phil went through, could that have taken place if they had allowed the two men in that room to have their cell phones? It could not have taken place. And the course of that man's life was changed forever. He will never see the world the same way ever again, and it took just a few minutes. But had they had their cell phones, it could not have possibly happened. Not to vilify cell phones, but to bring to light the reality of when they are appropriate and when they are not. The reason being, the inner chimp doesn't understand cell phones. As long as the distraction is present and the situation keeps getting complicated, the gap is too wide for connection to occur. And every time you want to get people charged about an issue and break down that empathy and morality, all you have to do is make it sound really complicated. Get that gap as wide as you can possibly make it. Disconnect us from one to another. And you cannot make the jump. You have to close the gap for that connection to occur.